place to get away, to see you again, see you again.
All right, Professor Klein back here giving you another lecture video. So good to see you again. Of course, I can't see you, but you can see me. You know what I mean. Today we're talking about the nervous system. And with the nervous system, it's all about the brain and spinal cord and nerves. This is pages 27 to 41 in your book. So make sure you're reading that book before watching this video, but we are ready to jump in to this PowerPoint slideshow. Only 15 slides to cover in this slideshow, and a lot of these should be a repeat from that original slideshow. So linking a few videos here for you to watch on YouTube. There's only one new one, Spinal Cord Model 3. Looks very similar to the other models, but slightly different, so make sure you check that one out. Here we've got a little bit of histology, continuing with our theme of histology of a neuron. So here we can see a neuron. As it extends out, we would have the cell body and the nucleus with all the dendrites extending into an axon right here. So axon kind of goes off the page, but this is an intricate intertwining of many neurons that make up a nerve. So think of a nerve down here. You can see this long stretch of a nerve, but lots of different neurons that make up that nerve itself. And let's give you an up-close example of that. This is the brain, and eventually the brain turns into the spinal cord right here. So let's say we have a nerve that branches off the bottom part of the spinal cord. This will be our nerve. Sometimes nerves can be up to 1 meter long. So they can be super long. And let's say this is my brain here on the side. It could travel out all the way down to the fingertips. So nerves can be pretty long. Something you'll also notice in this PowerPoint is a lot more just questions that aren't going to be answered until we meet in our small group. So for example, what are the 3 layers surrounding the various divisions of a nerve? And then which one of these within the histology slide is an artery, a vein, and a nerve? So look for those questions. Be ready to answer those questions when we meet as small groups. Continuing on, we can see the spinal nerves as they travel down the spinal cord. So one of the main parts of the nervous system is the spinal cord branching from the bottom of the brain stem. But as you go down each level, you've got branches of spinal nerves going to the left and the right sides of the body. Just want to mention that there is a difference between the vertebral bodies, or the vertebrae, which we would call, close this for a second, which we would call the vertebral column. That's the actual bone. But the spinal cord, that's the nervous system or the nervous tissue traveling through the vertebral column and coming out with these spinal nerves at each level. So be aware that those are different. Furthermore, we have 8 pairs of cervical, thoracic, 12 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. And question for you is, why is there only 8 cervical, or why are there 8 cervical spinal nerves but only 7 cervical vertebrae? So notice these are the nerves right here. but over here on the vertebral column, there's only 7. Everything else matches up with the same numbers, except that cervical region. I want you to research and find out why. And then another question, what does the spinal cord go through? What specifically is that hole called down the vertebral column? And furthermore, if we're talking the difference between the central nervous system and the peripheral, central brain, spinal cord, but as soon as it becomes a spinal nerve, then we're talking about peripheral. So these things right here, these are peripheral, but the central would be the spinal cord itself. Next, again, if you take a cross section of just one level of the spinal cord, it's going to look like this. We've seen this before. We've got the model of it. Here's the model of it that's on YouTube. Check this out. And as you can see, it cuts off the spinal nerve right about here. But imagine this traveling out to, let's say, the hand or the leg, as we can see in this picture here. So don't let this model throw you off. It does not stop here. It continues on to innervate part of the body. But you want to practice drawing this out. So maybe take a second now and draw it out. So pause and say, hey, do I really know this? This is probably the 7th time you've seen it. Try to draw out this cross section of a spinal cord section, noting some additional things, such as now we have things called horns. So before we talked about roots, dorsal root ganglion, but now within the gray matter, we have a dorsal horn, anterior horn or ventral horn, and a lateral horn. So 3 different horns that make up this gray matter. Those are important to note in some future slides. Now the spinal nerve we know is a 2-way street, but the dorsal root is a 1-way street, as well as the other ventral root on the front. So figure out which side is anterior and posterior based on just this picture, if you didn't have any labels, and then the difference between a ramus, a root, and a horn. Continuing on, we got to talk about those tracks again. Tracks, elevators going up and down, the 2 main ascending ones and the descending one as well. Now we also want to note that these are sensory going up, but descending, it's motor. So do start to make a difference or differentiation between these sensory ones taking sensory information up, such as light touch, pain, temperature, to your brain, but then from your brain going down, it would be motor movement of the body. But again, looking at the autonomic nervous system, we don't really use those tracks. Now we use the sympathetic trunks. So the staircases, right? Remember the staircase analogy? They're outside the vertebral column. They look like bubbles with the skinny kind of bridge between. Again, anytime you have a larger size, there's probably more function to it, and we're going to look at the function in a moment. So sympathetic trunks going down, as well as branching out as well. A key thing to note is that in order to get from the rami of a level of the spinal cord to the sympathetic trunk, you've got to cross over something called the ramus communicans or rami communicans. There's a gray one and a white one. The gray one is more medial and the white one is more lateral. So 2 of them here of the communicans. And now we're going to look at some importance of those horns. So remember we said dorsal horn, lateral horn, and ventral horn. Now you'll notice when we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, you might be asking yourself, where does this originate when you see that bear or a car almost hits you or whatever, and your body just goes into this sympathetic nervous system response? Well, it's technically from, move this, levels T1 to L2 of your spinal cord. So we call that the thoracolumbar region, T1 to L2. It's important to know that range because within that range, you've got lateral horns. And in those lateral horns, that's where the signal begins of the sympathetic nervous system. So if I say, what division of the spinal cord has lateral horns that would elicit a fight or flight response? The correct answer would be T1 to L2, thoracic 1 to lumbar 2. And as you can notice, they go out and they travel to the sympathetic trunks, and then they could travel up, they can travel down, or they can travel back out using the staircases to organs, lungs, different parts of the body. But it has to be the T1 to L2. Furthermore, here's another great shot of that lateral horn being the origination of the sympathetic nervous system, and then coming out, traveling, synapsing. So the key word with the sympathetic trunk is that that's where the synapse occurs. One neuron synapsing with another neuron. And then it goes out from there. Here are a few examples. When you get to physiology, you're going to look at each of these more specifically. For now, we want to know the different parts of the anatomy that that neuron or these neurons would travel to and a few different options. So again, remember, it synapses out in the sympathetic ganglion or the sympathetic trunk, and then it can go back the same level, or it can travel down, up, or even out towards an organ. And why that's important is, let's say your eyeball is above thoracic level T1, right? This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is T1 right here. If I put that up to myself, that'd be about this level. Your eyeball is up here, so you have this distance that you have to travel up in order to activate the eyeball with the sympathetic nervous system. So as you can see here, it starts down. This would be, let's say, T1, travels out over to that sympathetic trunk, synapses, actually up here, and then travels all the way up to the pupil. Let's say we're going to vasodilate, and it has that effect on the eyeball. Again, physiology is understanding the different steps. Anatomy is knowing the different parts of this process. Enough about the spinal cord. Now we're talking about the meninges, which actually does cover the spinal cord and the brain, which gave you the answer to this question right here, which we've referred to in this video as well. But now we want to really focus on these parts. Take a second, pause, take out a blank sheet of paper, and try to just draw lines and different layers and label these. So if the first time you need to do it where you look and label, that's fine. Then do it a second time without looking, challenge yourself, and whatever you miss, add that in, and then do it until you don't need any help to label those on a blank piece of paper. A couple things we want to focus on though is that we've got the scalp, the skull, and then underneath those things would be the three meninges: dura mater, which has two parts, arachnoid mater, and then pia mater. The things to note for now is that the dura mater is durable and tough. It's thick. The pia mater, super thin. And it actually, if you look over here, it will go deep within, let's say, the brain. The other two layers, they just kind of cover the top, but they don't really go deep within the indents of the brain. So the pia mater is much like saran wrap, and the dura mater is more like tin foil covering something. Last thing to note is that each one has a space underneath it. So subdural space, subarachnoid space, and specifically within the subarachnoid space, you have the cerebral spinal fluid, super important fluid we'll talk about later. But for now, remember CSF is in the subarachnoid space. So we talked about sympathetic nervous system. Now we got to talk about parasympathetic. And where does this originate? Well, this is going to originate from the cranial sacral regions. And what we mean by that are cranial nerves 3, 7, 4, and 5 here. Scratch that. Professor Klein read his Roman numerals wrong. It's 3, 7, 9, and 10. That speaks to the fact that we will use Roman numerals for the cranial nerves, so you'll have to make sure you're up to speed on those. Better than Professor Klein on that, but we'll do a better job in the future, as well as S2, sacral level S2 of the spinal cord to S4. So those two sections, which you can see up here, as well as down here, will produce the parasympathetic rest or digest, and you can see a few of the actions opposing the sympathetic nervous system. Here's a slide just kind of giving you another way to look at it, dividing it into that thoracolumbar region with the fight or flight, and then the rest or digest as being up top or down below. I try to relate some things to buildings or levels or floors, and again, certain floors of that hotel might be kind of rowdy. They might be fighting or flighting, but then let's say the top levels and the bottom levels, they just want to rest and eat on those floors. So if that helps you, then definitely utilize that analogy. And we're actually on to the final few slides of this PowerPoint slideshow, looking at a reflex arc. So oftentimes when we refer to a reflex arc, we talk about touching a hot stove or something hot and your hand pulling away, right? Your arm pulls away. That's called the withdrawal reflex. There's a YouTube video on how to draw that linked in one of the previous PowerPoints. But essentially, it talks about the 5 main parts of a reflex arc. You will want to know these 5 parts and be able to label and draw all of them on your exam. Now, when I say label and draw, I mean every single thing has to be included, including the locations in the body. For example, the first part is a receptor. But you can't just tell me receptor. You've got to tell me a receptor within the skin. So receptor within the skin picks up, hey, my hand is on a hot stove. That signal is sent down a sensory neuron, also called an afferent neuron. Afferent meaning towards something. And in this case, you're going towards the spinal cord. Once you get to the spinal cord is your integration center. So you not only have to say integration center, but you have to tell me you're at the spinal cord. Moreover, you would travel out the efferent neuron or motor neuron. So now you have motor signal, sensory coming in, motor going out to get to the effector. And in this case, it's muscle, skeletal muscle. But sometimes the effector is an organ or your brain or something different like that. So know those 5 parts and know how to label each location of those 5 parts. Here's another example of a reflex arc. There's many different types of reflex arcs in the body, but here you can see the same general setup. This is like if you were to travel to the doctor's office and they take one of these reflex hammers and they hit it on part of your body, in this case right below the kneecap. What's actually happening is it's stretching the quadriceps when you do that. And anytime you rapidly stretch a muscle, it could be torn. So it does not want to rapidly stretch. So it sends a signal via the receptor down the sensory neuron or afferent neuron. And at this point, I want you to start to note what part of the nervous system is traveling through. So in this case, it'd be traveling through the spinal nerve, right where this area is, right here. Then it goes to, you tell me, what's this bubble called? Think about this bubble for a second. And if you said it's the DRG, dorsal root ganglion, you'd be correct. How about this next part? If you said dorsal root, you'd be correct. Dorsal posterior. So that's how you know this side is posterior, is the dorsal root ganglion and the dorsal root. Now you're in here. What's this part called? Take a second to think about it. Pause the video if you need to. This is where learning occurs. So this is the dorsal horn. Dorsal horn. This would be the ventral horn. Anterior horn right here. So I guess I can make this bigger. Traveling out after you go through the integration center, which is the spinal cord. Again, remember both these things have to be labeled. You're traveling out the ventral root or anterior root right here via a motor neuron or efferent. E versus A. This one's efferent away, down to the effector organ, which in this case happens to be the same thing, happens to be the same muscle. And it's going to say contract the quadriceps, shorten the muscle because it doesn't want to be stretched, and it prevents against tearing. Also in this example, it's going to actually relax the hamstrings, which is the opposite muscle, just to help shorten the quadriceps even more. All right, so again, make sure you know all 5 parts. I cannot emphasize that enough. Be able to draw it out as well. And last part, before we finish this PowerPoint, is I've got this slide here because oftentimes we'll talk about damage to the nervous system as taking away the ability to move your legs or taking away function of certain muscles. But just because you don't have the function to those muscles doesn't mean you're limited in life. And here's some great examples of individuals who have had nervous system damage, whether to the spinal cord or the peripheral nerves, but have overcome and really made the best of life. And that concludes your nervous system PowerPoint slideshow. We'll be talking quite a bit about these things in small groups this week.